In March of 1870, a notice was entered into the record at Upper Fort Garry in the Red River settlement. It concerned a prisoner held under guard by the provisional authority that had recently assumed control of the colony. The man's name was Thomas Scott. His confinement and what followed would be reported in newspapers across Canada and beyond, though his name is now seldom recalled outside specialized histories. The settlement in which he was held lay along the Red River, in what was then known as the Red River Colony. It was a region in transition. The Hudson's Bay Company had agreed to transfer Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada. Surveyors arrived before political arrangements were settled. Many residents, particularly the Métis population under the leadership of Louis Riel, resisted what they viewed as an imposed administration. Thomas Scott was born in Ireland and later immigrated to Canada West. By occupation, he worked as a laborer and was associated with railway construction. In the months preceding his arrest, he had joined a party of Canadian settlers opposed to the provisional government established at Red River. Contemporary accounts in Ontario newspapers described him as a committed partisan of Canadian annexation. In December 1869, members of the Canadian Party attempted to challenge the authority of Riel's provisional government. They were detained and confined at Upper Fort Garry, the Hudson's Bay Company post that had become the administrative center of the settlement. Among those taken into custody was Thomas Scott. Surviving records and later testimony indicate that he resisted confinement and clashed with his guards. Statements later published in Ontario alleged that Scott behaved with open defiance, directing insults toward members of the provisional government. Métis witnesses, in turn, testified that he had threatened violence. The precise wording of these exchanges varies between sources. What remains consistent is that Scott became a particular concern to his captors. In February 1870, a form of tribunal was convened by the provisional government. Documentation of its proceedings survives only in partial accounts, including recollections and printed defenses issued afterward. Thomas Scott was charged with insubordination and with having taken up arms against the provisional authority. The tribunal found him guilty. The sentence pronounced was death. Appeals for clemency were reportedly made by certain inhabitants of the settlement. Others urged firmness, fearing that leniency would weaken the authority of the provisional regime at a moment of political uncertainty. Newspapers in eastern Canada would later debate whether the tribunal possessed lawful standing to impose such a penalty. On the 4th of March 1870, Thomas Scott was brought before a firing squad within the walls of the fort. Contemporary descriptions record that he faced his executioners in the yard. A priest was said to have attended him, though accounts differ as to the extent of religious rites administered. Shots were fired. He was declared dead shortly thereafter. His body was interred within the settlement. Word of the execution traveled eastward by dispatch and newspaper report. In Ontario, public meetings were convened. Editorials demanded retribution. The name of Thomas Scott, once confined to a fort on the Red River, entered parliamentary debate and became a catalyst in the political crisis that followed. The reports reached Toronto within days. By telegraph and reprinted dispatch, the execution of Thomas Scott was described in language that varied sharply depending upon the source. Some accounts emphasized his status as a Protestant laborer from Ontario. Others questioned the authority of the Red River Tribunal. What had been a regional detention now assumed national consequence. Public meetings were organized in towns across Canada West. Resolutions were drafted and read aloud. Speakers described Scott as a martyr to Canadian sovereignty. Petitions were forwarded to Ottawa. The tone of these gatherings is preserved in newspaper columns and printed broadsides, many of which survive in provincial archives. In the House of Commons at Ottawa, members raised questions concerning federal authority over the Red River settlement. The Dominion government had negotiated the transfer of Rupert's Land, yet it had not fully established its administrative presence. The execution intensified scrutiny of that transition. Parliamentary debates from the spring session record repeated references to Scott's death. Meanwhile, at Upper Fort Garry, The provisional government continued its efforts to negotiate terms of entry into Confederation. Louis Riel and his associates drafted a list of rights to secure local representation, protection of land tenure, and recognition of existing institutions. Surviving texts of these demands demonstrate that political negotiations proceeded even as anger mounted in the East. Scott's body became a matter of contention. Conflicting reports circulated regarding the location of his burial. Some Ontario newspapers alleged concealment. Later investigations would attempt to identify the precise site. Documentation remains incomplete. No official exhumation record from the period conclusively resolved the question. In Ontario, Scott's family and associates pressed for accountability. Memorial notices were published. Clergymen referenced the execution in sermons. The event entered campaign rhetoric in provincial politics. Although the Dominion government did not immediately pursue criminal proceedings, the question of responsibility remained active in public discourse. By mid-1870, the federal cabinet authorized a military expedition to assert Canadian authority in the Red River region. Officially designated as the Red River Expedition and commanded by Garnet Wolseley, the force included regular British troops and Canadian militia. Parliamentary papers record the stated objective as peaceful transition, though the expedition's scale indicated preparation for resistance. As the expedition advanced westward, Riel and several members of the provisional government departed the settlement. Contemporary correspondence suggests concern for personal safety should federal forces arrive amid public outrage over Scott's death. When the expedition reached Fort Garry in August, it encountered no organized military defense. The fort was taken without engagement. The Union Jack was raised. Military reports filed in London, and Ottawa described the occupation as orderly. Yet acts of reprisal against suspected supporters of the provisional government were later alleged in private letters and memoirs. These accounts remain subjects of historical debate. The political settlement proceeded. In May 1870, prior to the expedition's arrival, Parliament had passed the Manitoba Act, creating a new province and incorporating several of the rights negotiated by Red River representatives. The statute appears in the Dominion's sessional papers. Its passage demonstrates that constitutional arrangements and punitive sentiment unfolded simultaneously. Thomas Scott's name continued to surface in speeches and editorials throughout that year. He was invoked as justification for firm governance in the West. At the same time, among many in the Red River community, his execution was defended as an assertion of local authority during a period of uncertainty. The immediate crisis subsided, yet its personal consequences did not. Riel departed into exile in the United States. No court in Ontario tried him for Scott's death at that time, though warrants and denunciations were recorded. Scott himself, once a railway laborer among many, had become a fixed reference in a larger national dispute. The execution within the walls of Upper Fort Garry had altered the course of negotiations and hardened positions across provinces separated by vast distance. It had also ensured that Thomas Scott's name would endure in print, even as his personal history remained comparatively brief. In the years immediately following the occupation of Fort Garry, the name of Thomas Scott remained present in Canadian political speech. Pamphlets printed in Ontario described him as a victim of unlawful authority. His execution was cited during election campaigns and in debates concerning federal control of the West. Bound volumes of these speeches, preserved in legislative libraries, show how frequently his death was invoked. For the family he left behind, the matter was more private. Census returns and parish registers record their continued residence in Ontario. Memorial references appear intermittently in church publications, yet no extensive personal archive survives. What is known of Scott's character derives largely from partisan testimony given during and after his confinement at Red River. Meanwhile, Louis Riel remained in exile. Correspondence from the early 1870s indicates that warrants related to Scott's execution were still active in Ontario. Though elected to Parliament by supporters in Manitoba, Riel did not take his seat. Official journals record his absence. The shadow of the firing squad at Upper Fort Garry followed him in public memory. Efforts were periodically made to determine the precise location of Scott's grave. Accounts from former residents of the settlement were collected decades later. Some claimed knowledge of the burial site within the former fort grounds. Others disputed these recollections. Archaeological confirmation has remained uncertain, and no contemporaneous burial register has conclusively resolved the matter. As the province of Manitoba developed, public attention shifted to other concerns: railway expansion, immigration, agricultural settlement. The execution that had once stirred mass meetings in Toronto gradually receded from daily discourse. In official provincial histories printed toward the end of the 19th century, Scott's death is summarized in measured paragraphs rather than extended denunciation. When Riel returned to Canadian politics in the 1880s and was later tried and executed for his role in the Northwest Resistance, references to Thomas Scott reappeared in courtroom argument and newspaper commentary. Transcripts from Riel's 1885 trial include reminders of the earlier execution at Red River. The two events became linked in public narrative, though separated by 15 years and distinct circumstances. In subsequent decades, historians debated the legality of the provisional government's tribunal and the conduct of Thomas Scott during his imprisonment. Some emphasized the fragility of authority in a territory undergoing transfer. Others focused on the inflammatory language reported in contemporary newspapers. These interpretations, published in scholarly journals and regional studies, rest upon the same limited documentary base. Today, the physical structure of Upper Fort Garry no longer stands as it did in 1870. Portions were dismantled in the late 19th century. The site, now incorporated into the city of Winnipeg, has been marked and interpreted in various forms. Archival photographs preserve its former appearance: wooden palisades, inner yard, modest administrative rooms. Thomas Scott's life, as preserved in record, occupies only a narrow span of documented pages. An immigrant laborer, a partisan in a territorial dispute, a prisoner tried by a provisional authority, and a man executed by firing squad. For a season, his name moved assemblies and influenced policy. Then it settled into footnotes and regional monographs. The documents remain: newspaper columns browned with age, parliamentary debates bound in leather, recollections printed long after the fact. They attest that his execution once carried national consequence. They also show how swiftly public memory can narrow. In the quiet language of the archive, Thomas Scott endures not as symbol alone, but as a recorded participant in a contested transfer of land and authority.